안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to K-Law Forum 2021. I am Choi Ji-yeon, a senior research fellow at Korea Legislation Research Institute, or KLRI, and your host for today's event. The forum, organized and hosted by KLRI, will discuss in depth the current issues in Korean legal studies and education with much renowned Korean law experts from Korea, the US, and Europe. To commemorate the 10th anniversary of K-Law Forum, this year's forum will be streamed live on YouTube so as to ensure more people than usual may take part. And it seems that already quite a lot of people are connected to YouTube from home and abroad, and I hope you will continue to stay with us today as well as tomorrow. The forum will be held over the next 2 days, the 8th and 9th of July. There will be 3 separate sessions with Korean law specialists from Korea, Europe, West Coast of the US, and East Coast of the US. And I would like to ask for your interest and active participation. Before we begin, let me give you a few announcements first. As you know, COVID-related situation is quite grave, and we have people joining us both online and offline, as you know, with offline attendance kept to minimum to comply with the physical distancing policy to prevent further spread of COVID-19. Online participants that want to receive the certificate of attendance that we will be issuing, please upload a screenshot of the event on the event page, and we will send you an application form after the event. For more information, scan the QR code on the YouTube screen or refer to the Show More link at the bottom of the YouTube screen. Now, let us begin the forum with the opening remarks from President Kim Ge-hong of KLRI. Our president is the 13th of the president of KLR, and he has served at high senior positions at the Korean government. Please welcome President Kim.
네, 여러분.
Hello everyone. I am Kim Ge-hong, President of Korea Legislation Research Institute. We have hosted the Korean Society of International Law, and every year we are hosting the K-Law Forum where people researching, studying, and also doing a lot of work related with the law gather together. People are paying greater attention, especially the scholars are very much interested in Korean law, recognizing that we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the K-Law Forum, but unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we weren't able to host the offline meeting, but rather we are hosting the hybrid meeting. But as I mentioned last year, thanks to the technology development, we are able to be connected with the western part of the United States, eastern part, as well as the European countries. Despite difficulties, participants residing in different continents are joining here today, which is very grateful. This year's K-Law Forum, just like we did last year, considering the time differences, we are having 3 sessions. It would have been great if we are gathered at one place and see face to face and discuss our ideas, but at the same time, I believe that this is a great idea by dividing the sessions. Today, we are very honored to be joined by Professor Pablo Sanz from Spain, and also he will be talking about research policy, technology law, and digital business, comparing the Korea and European countries. And also, we are joined by Professor Bajit Daiba, who have taught at Seoul National University but now lives in Austria. She will talk about fundamental freedoms in the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And also, we are joined by research fellow Kim Gap-le of Korea Capital Market Institute and Professor Oh Sun-young of Sungsil University, who will be discussing the two presenters' presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much.
앞서 말
As mentioned before, this year commemorates the 10th anniversary of the forum. We have very special congratulatory messages from those who have made the forum what it is today. So let's watch together.
2012년 세계 한국법 연구자의 네트워크
Back in 2012, I launched 2012 Global Korea Law in pursuit of building a network for scholars studying Korean law. The conference has now been renamed to the KLRI Forum, and this year marks the 10th anniversary of the conference. I'd like to convey my sincere congratulations. I also would like to send my special thanks and support to the President of Korean Legislation Research Institute, jurists, research fellows, and employees of the institutions for devoting themselves to promoting this project. Korea is an incredibly unique country. Some compare Korea to a frog with a tail of tadpole, which is used as a metaphor to represent Korea as a developed country with the experience of a developing country from its liberation in 1945. Korea still remembers its past, which gives Korea its uniqueness. I believe this uniqueness enables Korea to contribute to the world in a better way. 10 years ago, when I was the president of the KLRI, I studied the conference with this belief. In 2004, I worked at the University of Michigan Law School as a research professor. Working there, I had a chance to talk with another professor. Back then, I saw Korea as a developing country. Out of wonder, the professor asked me back why I still consider my country as a developing country. He believed Korea was now developed country. Recollecting the conversation, the international stature of Korea seems to have changed since 2000. Now that 20 years have passed by, Korea has become a developed country both in name and substance, which is proven by the fact that it is often invited to G7 summits. In Korea, the term developed country refers to a country that enjoys higher socio-economic development. That is why some Koreans doubt the fact that Korea is a developed country. But I have full confidence that Korea has joined the ranks of developed countries by all means. Korea is an exceptional case in that at one time, the least developed country grew into a fully developed one in mere decades. When I visited research institutions studying in Korean law like University of Washington. I also met a number of researchers attaching importance to Korea's case in the perspective of the relationship between law and development. Such acknowledgement brought me insight that our experience could be a strong precedent for developing countries around the world, with greater importance being put on which legal system we adopt, what kind of trial and error we had, and how the system promoted socio-economic development. In that sense, as much as it is important to study current issues, particular attention should be given to how Korean law in the past shaped the economy and the study. We need to do more research. That research belongs to an area of study where experts from various fields and jurists should cooperate. The goal I had when launching the conference was to review Korea's legal system from a perspective of law and economics and the sociology of law, and thereby explain how Korea achieved both economic growth and democratization. Today, the K-Law Forum broadens its scope of participation from the US and China to Europe. Now's the time for all of us to dedicate ourselves to ensuring the invaluable experience of Korea nourish the knowledge of the entirety of mankind. Korean law researchers around the world, I plead to you to dive deep into the precious experience reflected in Korean law and do not hesitate to share it with the global community. Once again, I'd like to commemorate all those involved with the 10th K-Law Forum. Thank you very much.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
안녕하십니까.
Distinguished guests, I am Lee Ik-hyun, the Vice President of Mokwon University. Honorable President Kim Ki-hong and everyone, and KLRI, congratulations on the 10th anniversary of K-Law Forum. And thank you in advance to all the presenters and discussants who will be sharing their invaluable insights. It's a great honor for me to extend my congratulations for this auspicious event. My deep gratitude goes to President Kim Ki-hong for the invitation to join today. Although the event is regrettably being held online mainly, I believe the event is special in multiple ways. Korea's response has been recognized as a successful model of dealing with COVID-19 crisis as well as showcasing the excellence of democracy. Such response would not have been possible without a sound legal framework, and such a framework would not have been possible without the valuable contributions by KLRI. I believe the crisis has proven that Korea's legal system has now advanced to the level enjoyed by those nations with mature legal system. It is true that many countries are interested in benchmarking Korea's legal system, and K-Law Forum is a project that serves as a platform to further advance Korea and global legal system through active exchanges with the leading nations of the world. The forum, I am sure, has been able to continue on with its journey and mark its 10th anniversary, even expanding to include European participation, thanks to much support and effort made by those in attendance today. I believe the project and the forum will continue to grow and advance with full support from KLRI under the able leadership of President Kim Ki-hong. I wish the forum much success, and once again, congratulations on the 10th anniversary. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank former President Kim Yo-won and former President Lee Ik-hyun, who have provided us a very special message despite their very busy schedule. And I will now introduce our presenter and discussant. And our first presenter is Professor Pablo Sanz-Bayan of the Commercial Law of the Camillus Pontifical University. He has received a PhD in business law and has studied at Cambridge University of the UK, as well as Max Planck University, as well as Melbourne and Sydney Universities of Australia. So he has conducted research at diverse institutions, and he has been researching lately about the digital technology related law and policies to be applicable to the financial industry. And through his presentation today, he's going to talk to us about his latest research. And our second presenter is Professor Birgit Diber, who is currently teaching at the School of Law of Seoul National University. And Professor Diber has majored in the German Constitution and the European law, and he has conducted much research at different courts, and currently she's working as a research professor in Vietnam. And our first discussant is Mr. Kim Gamne, a research fellow at Korea Capital Market Institute, and his main area of research is securities regulation, as well as the financial taxes, and so on. And our last discussant is Professor Woo Sun-young of Sungsil University. She is yet to join us. I have heard that she's on her way to join us. And Professor Oh has majored in trade regulation, and she is going to be discussing the paper, second paper, that is the paper to be presented by Professor Diber. And we also have President Kim Ge-hong of KLRI, as well as a research fellow Bae Kyung-ju of the same institute, and they will be participating in discussion. And we'll now begin with the first presentation. And the first presenter is Professor Pablo Sanz-Bayan, the professor of commercial law at Camilla Pontifical University. He's going to talk to us about the research policy on technology law and digital business, a Korean and European approach. And professor has half an hour to make the presentation, and we will move directly to a discussion after the presentation. Professor, please.
Good afternoon. 안녕하세요. I would like to begin my presentation by thanking the Korean Legislation Research Institute for the coordination of this fantastic meeting. The title of my presentation is Research and Policy on Technology Law and Digital Business, a Korean and European approach. Next. The purpose is to shed light on the importance of law, legal education, and research to enhance and improve social and economic relations between South Korea and the European Union. As I will discuss in my presentation, regarding the regulation of the Internet and digital business, the countries of the European Union and South Korea face common challenges that make their cooperation and friendship a strategic axis. Next. According to the World Bank Ease of Doing Business scores, South Korea has one of the best scores at ease of doing business, with an 84 in the last 2 years. South Korea is Europe's 8th largest sport, while the European Union is Korea's 3rd largest sport, and the European Union is Korea's biggest foreign direct investor. Next. Both South Korea and Europe are strong international powers who are outshined by the two superpowers and its constant power struggle, China and the United States. South Korea and Europe have many things in common, among which I would like to highlight the shared values, principles, and goals. Moreover, these two powers have a similar legal system. Both are civil law systems, and both get influenced by common law due to the great hold the United States has in the international sphere. Besides the US hold, the European Union also was influenced by the common law by the United Kingdom and the practice of case law in the Court of Justice of the European Union. However, there is a possibility for Europe to experience less of this effect due to the Brexit, which raised the question, could Europe and South Korea ever conquer the common law influence in their practice, especially in everything related to technology? Maybe if we join forces and continue strengthening our ties, we might become autonomous and will not be under anyone's influence, or at least not as much. I believe we should take the conflict between the two superpowers and learn what not to do. Next. In recent years, I have had the opportunity to get closer to the Korean reality thanks to the invitations of your institution. The first time in 2017 and the second one in 2018. They were two very rewarding experiences that allow me to visit your wonderful country and learn a lot. Next. On both occasions, I had the opportunity to learn not only about Korean law, international influence, but also about the importance of cooperation in research and education in strengthening ties between both governments, cultures, and societies. There is no doubt that many achievements are being accomplished, such as the free trade agreement. There is much potential to create and develop economic growth for both parties by deepening the educational and legal connections that exist. Next. To achieve this goal, I will follow the next structure. In the first place, I propose to analyze the starting context, pointing out the existing challenges and problems in terms of IT regulation and digital business. Second, I will examine the legislative developments in this field, briefly exploring the points where the position of Korea and Europe converge and diverge, some reasons behind it. Finally, I will highlight the importance of soft power by enhancing educational and socio-cultural relations as a premise so that there can be a lasting and prosperous cooperation within digital markets and for their better joint regulation and supervision. Next. First, it is clear to begin by recognizing the success that the free trade agreement between South Korea and the European Union represents at all levels. As we will be explained in the following presentation, this international agreement is a milestone that will greatly facilitate the momentum of everything that we are going to point out below here. Leaving this issue aside, we must highlight the importance for the European Union of having a commercial partner such as South Korea, which is leader in IT. In fact, about 92.7% of 52.2 million people in South Korea are connected to the web. Many places like train stations and community centers have public Wi-Fi. About 88% of people use connected smartphones. Next. This makes South Korea one of the most innovative and connected countries in the world, a global leader in internet connectivity and speed. Next. That said, It should also be noted that both the European Union and Korea are highly dependent on American big techs in the development of their markets and digital services. Indeed, the United States has Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. On the other side, China has Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi. Next. But Korea also has solid and competitive and navigators such as Kakao, Papago, Coupang, and Naver. And we cannot forget about Samsung and Hyundai and others Korean big techs and big corporations. Next. In the case of Hyundai, we can clearly see the effort on trying to be closer seen to correctly adapt to the European market. Hyundai Motor opened their production facilities in the Czech Republic, the European Union, in 2008. According to the Financial Times, Samsung Electronics has projected an almost 45% jump in its first quarter profits on strong sales of smartphones and home appliances. And also, Samsung is estimated to have accounted for 23% of global smartphone sales in the first quarter of 2021, up from 16% in the previous quarter. Next. According to the CNBC in 2018, with a valuation of more than 5 billion and 1.54 billion in venture capital investment, Coupang is the fastest growing and best financed e-commerce site of all time in South Korea. It dominates a highly competitive e-commerce market where no one is making a profit. The company has confirmed that half of South Korean 51 million people have downloaded its mobile application. That may be why Amazon, already struggling to crack markets in Asia, has yet to set foot in the South Korean market. Next. According to Yonhap News Agency, while Samsung regained the top spot in the European smartphone market, China Xiaomi was third. Huawei took fifth spot. The South Korean tech giant represented 32% of smartphone sales in Europe in the January-March period, up 2 percentage points from a year earlier, and beat its American rival Apple, which settled for 28% according to market tracker Counterpoint Research. Next. However, knowing the strengths of a business partner is not enough to achieve success in future economic exchanges. European authorities and professionals must take an effort to learn more about South Korea. Learn its legal system, social customs, and for the bravest, also a little its language. Business opportunities between South Korea and the European Union will improve as mutual knowledge increase and improves and more relations of educational and cultural exchange are open. In this sense, we as lawyers have a very important role. European and Korean markets need to become more integrated with easy to understand and accessible regulation. In terms of digital business, as we will see later, this point is crucial due to the ubiquity of the data and existing problems in relation to aspects such as dispute resolution and jurisdiction and applicable law. Next. In this sense, we must ask ourselves about the legal system of both parties and how much they are similar or different. South Korea has a civil law legal system, as the laws were influenced largely by the European civil law system. However, the USA law has influenced more recent legislations, in particular in the field of business and contract law. The same thing happens in the countries of the European Union. The majority tradition is civil law, but common law penetrates its institutions through the business world. Therefore, South Korea and the European Union share a common characteristic. Their educational and legal culture is predominantly based on civil law, but large commercial operations are structured with common law concepts and categories. The trend in the European Union could change after Brexit. Next. On the other hand, from my experience as an academic, I can say that it is difficult to understand a legal system such as Korean, not so much because of its difficulty, nor because of some interpretative problems derived from translations, but mainly because of the scarcity of legal doctrine accessible with ease in Europe. For instance, European legal scholars will need more detailed books about corporate and financial laws of Korea to analyze current issues within those fields from both academic and practical perspectives, providing a tool understanding a Korean law in a business and financial context. Next. These tools are increasingly needed by European lawyers working on investments operations in South Korea, as well as researchers and academics who need to quickly become familiar not only with Korean positive law, but also with its legal culture and social and economic trends. On the one hand, legal publications have to offer added value to delve into the fundamental principles of Korean business law and landmark cases in the field. On the other hand, academic publications should also include an extensive analysis of the most recent developments and of current issues raised by recent court cases. Next. Rich and extensive books with insight from leading scholars and practitioners will be of great benefit both to European lawyers who have clients with business interests in Korea and to scholars of international corporate law and governance. Next. Let's now briefly examine some legislative developments in the field of digital business regulation. The first aspect to consider is whether the legal system promotes digital services. In the European Union, the key idea, the central idea, is the digital single market. It follows the idea of free movement of persons, services, and capitals, while ensuring individuals and businesses access to fair and safe online activities, digital goods, and services, despite of their place of residence. In Europe, note that despite the progress, there is an imbalance in bargaining power between gatekeepers and general users, due to the fact that business users depend on gatekeepers' platforms. They need to be present in those platforms. This strengthens gatekeepers' role due to these e-commerce trends and can lead to entry barriers. Next. Let's see some examples of unfair practice by gatekeepers. For example, Italian authorities found that WhatsApp forced its users to share their personal data with Facebook. The German authorities found that Facebook abused its dominance by applying terms and conditions which made the use of its social network conditional upon Facebook's possibility to collect and combine user data from multiple sources. Next. Korea does the right thing since the competent authority imposes fine and remedies on neighbor for ranking, self-referencing, and anti-steering, due to the fact that gatekeepers should not favor themselves by ranking their services and products. The importance of e-commerce and digital platforms in general have experienced a remarkable increase during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the great dependency of users on these platforms and services. Next. In this context, the European Union has accelerated its digital agenda through the Digital Services Act that responds to the need to update digital regulation to consider new challenges. We are facing currently increasing risks online from different illegal activities and risks towards their fundamental rights, in coordination and inefficiency of the overseeing of these threats and problems that only grow more difficult to address due to the regulation at national level that member states have already made, creating barriers to the potential European regulations. To solve this, the European Union, among other solutions, the preferred one is to create asymmetric measures with stronger obligations for very large online platforms. This will allow new and smaller competitors into the market, by which we will experience innovation while also targeting these threats, achieving transparency and safety by also opting for a cooperation between the states and the European Union. Next. Now we must approach the regulatory framework for data protection and privacy, as it is a cornerstone of trust in digital business. In terms of regulation of privacy on the internet, the European General Data Protection Regulation is considered the toughest privacy and security law in the world. With this regulation, fundamental rights and freedoms protection is updated to this new era. It also allows free movement of personal data within the states of the European Union. The idea is that by creating a single market for data, the European Union will become more competitive at a global scale by allowing innovative processes, products and services, since business will have more data available. Next. In Korea, as you know, the Personal Information Act, PIPA, regulates data protection. On the other hand, the Credit Information Act regulates the use of information about a person's credit. Also, we find the Network Act. These three data privacy laws have recently been amended extensively. The amendments to the data privacy laws are intended to streamline the regulatory framework for data protection and governance, addressing the need for efficient use of data for the emerging economy based on new technologies such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and big data. Next. In this regard, it seems appropriate to point out that on 30 March 2021, the European Commission announced in a joint statement with South Korea Data Protection Authority, the Personal Information Protection Commission, PIPC, the successful conclusion of the adequacy talks between the European Union and South Korea. Such adequacy decision will enable the free flow of personal data from the European Union to South Korea, covering both private and public data controllers, and ultimately benefiting commercial data transfers and facilitating regulatory cooperation. The adequacy talks began over 4 years ago in January 2017, and this announcement brings them closer to receiving this adequacy decision this year. South Korea has been preparing for this adequacy decision by amending its data protections law, which it did last year, to, for example, enact the new Personal Information Protection Act, which confirmed the independence and powers of the Personal Information Protection Commission. This was referred to in the announcement as confirming the high degree of convergence between the European Union and South Korea for data protections, and was a major step in the adequacy talks. Next. The announcement also complements the European Union Republic of Korea Free Trade Agreement, and both sides agree that this will aid in their commitment to share values concerning privacy and cooperation. The framework for the future adequacy decision relies on the strong supervision of the PIPC. The European Commission will now begin launching the decision-making procedure to get the adequacy decision adopted in the upcoming months. The European Data Protection Board will publish an opinion before formal approval by a committee comprised of representatives of the European Union member states. Once it is approved, the Commission can adopt the adequacy decision, thereby introducing the free flow of personal data between the European Union and South Korea. Next. It is obvious to me that the transition to a truly and fully untaxed economy and seamless implementation of artificial intelligence technology require fundamental changes to be made to the existing legal system. Comprehensive legal reform and relaxation of regulatory requirements across various areas, including medicine, healthcare, finance, and e-commerce, is necessary for an untapped economy. For example, both in South Korea and in Europe, there are currently a number of strict regulations applicable to telemedicine, which will need to be reviewed and likely amended in order to accommodate the growing demand for remote medical consultations brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next. Finally, there is a set of emerging trends in the Korean digital business regulations that are very relevant for European investors in the Korean market. Since March 2019, the IT Network Act in Korea requires offshore business that offer IT services in Korea meeting certain thresholds in terms of global revenue, local revenue, or number of users to designate a local agent for regulatory compliance purposes. Additionally, we can point out other significant measures of Korean regulations that European operators and investors in digital markets must observe. Regarding insurance or reserves for data breach, any IT service provider that maintains personal information with respect to 1,000 or more users is required to maintain a level of insurance of reserve for potential liability in the case of violation of data protection law. In addition, Korea has expanded its regulatory sandbox, which is a framework for temporary permits and exemptions to enable testing and introduction of innovative business amid an otherwise restrictive or murky regulatory environment. Now, regulators may grant a special regulatory exemption for its demonstrations purposes to allow limited scope testing. For its part, the European Union has not been able to unify a common regulatory sandbox framework for the 27 member states. Next. Having reviewed some legislative trends in IT and digital business, we can affirm that the key in the economy is trust. Trust needs mutual knowledge and common projects and achievements. The internet and the world of digital business is not exception in this regard. Success in the field also requires strengthening relations between South Korea and Europe beyond formal regulatory and diplomatic channels. In particular, education and popular culture is possibly a key factor in enabling greater cooperations and synergies. In this sense, the key to soft power is to effectively achieve greater economic integration and cooperation. The use of soft power is what really moves the trends in the international community nowadays, what moves society trends and what is popular. That's why soft power strategies have to be well thought out and constantly updated so that they don't go out of style. Next. There is no doubt that the most popular countries nowadays is South Korea. And this has to do with their soft power and Korean wave, Hallyu. Regarding South Korean place in Asia, and according to Soft Power 30, in 2019, South Korea was the second in the Asian countries soft power report with a score of 63, while Japan was first with a 75 score. In the last 5 years, we have been seeing more and more things about Korea. South Korea, through the creative economy that led to the Korean wave, created a very strong and efficient soft power policy that has become part of our daily lives. This Korean wave first arrived at its Asian neighbors, but rapidly spread to the rest of the world. South Korea occupies now the 19th place in the world regarding soft power. The factors taken into account by soft power 30 are enterprise, engagement, culture, government, education, and digital. South Korea is in the top 10 in digital and enterprises. Next. We should keep in mind that these were the results of the report made in 2019, which means that it is reasonable to believe that South Korea may rank higher in the next report, since the soft power has experienced great success, such as the Parasite wins at the Oscar, BTS nomination to the Grammys, and topping the Billboard Hot 100 list several times with the 3 songs, one of which was completely in Korean language, Life Goes On. To which we have to add the popularity of Korean dramas on streaming platforms such as Netflix, that, according to the Yonhap News Agency, has led to a high demand on Korean creators in global content productions. Next. Some say this all starting in the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, which gave Korea the spotlight they need. And later it was Gangnam Style in 2012 what triggered the cultural wave by becoming the first Korean music video with 100 million views on YouTube. After this, the next big thing for Korea were the 4 wins out of 6 Oscars nominations for the movie Parasite, becoming the first Korean movie ever to win 4 Oscars and the first foreign language film to ever win a top prize at the Oscars. Next. It is worth mentioning the BTS phenomenon. BTS is a Korean music group that after many struggles, they have become the biggest artist in the world with 37 million followers on Twitter. They are topping the Billboard charts, winning countless awards in Asia and in the USA. They have achieved things that were incredible, breaking all the records in the world, and they did all of that without any type of privilege, just their hard work and their talent. They have broken the language barrier, and they helped Korea to open to the world and the world to open to Korea. They made up 4.7 billion of the country's GDP. However, their impact goes beyond music. They have joined with UNICEF in 2017 to create the Love Myself campaign to improve human rights and the lives of children and teens all over the world. We could say that everything BTS does creates an impact in South Korea and in the world. They are global influencers, and this became clear when in 2018, they gave a speech at the launch of Generation Unlimited at the United Nations General Assembly. They promote Korean products, foods in Europe. They show their European fans the Korean culture, such as their traditional instruments, clothes like the hanbok, and cultural heritage by recording performance during the pandemic. According to The Diplomat, in 2017, the 7% of the tourists in Korea were there because of BTS. Next. Even the Korean government is taking advantage of the group's popularity to further their soft power by partnering with them to sponsor classes with those books at European universities such as the École Normale Supérieure and EDEC Business School of France. South Korea government is not wrong for wanting to use BTS and other Korean pop groups as their main tool of soft power because they engage with millions of people who are eager to learn more about the country on the internet. Next. I would like to finish with some conclusions. Korea can contribute a lot to the societies of the European Union, and European countries can also contribute to the development of Korean society. We have common interests and achievements, but also similar problems and challenges. The situation and developments of digital markets and their regulation demonstrate this. Education, research between both parties, and in particular, policies and regulation of the internet and digital businesses has to be the basis for building a better future for Korean and European citizens. The lack of knowledge of each other can lead to thinking we are very different when in reality we are similar and we have common views, values, principles, and goals. The key to strengthening our ties is knowing each other's history, culture, legal background, and share our point of views so that we can start working from the common ground and create a future together where we can become more than what we already are. Next, thank you. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다.
Oh, yes, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. You have talked about IT regulation and the digital business. And you have also talked about the different responses by Korea and the European government when it comes to digital businesses. And in order to see prosperity in digital market, there has to be improvement in education as well as culture, which means that the soft power has to be enhanced. And you have also compared the Korean law with the European law, which is based on the civil law. And what was very interesting was this, that Professor, in your presentation, have shown us that you have participated in the conferences held by our research institute, and you are very much interested in a Korean legal system. And you have also used the term untact, which is a very Korean English. And that, I think, proved how interested you are in the Korean law and the Korean culture. And to study the Korean law in other countries, both the practitioners and the educators need to study Korean law, and in order to do that, they need more translation. And you mentioned that there's not enough such translated data. And we do have a translation center at our institute, so we will make efforts to have more translation available. And also, we do have an education program called the KLRI Academy, and so we will promote this academy so it can be used by more people going forward. And about the digital market regulation, we will have in-depth discussion, and that discussion is going to be made by Mr. Kim Gamne. And while he is preparing, we're going to be listening to the second presentation. And a second presentation is going to be made by Professor Birgit Diber of the Seoul National University. She's going to talk to us about the fundamental freedoms in the EU-Korea FTA in comparison with the WTO and EU law. Please.
Professor Diver, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning in Europe. Good evening in Korea. Thank you for the Korean Legislation Research Institute for the invitation. As you said, I will talk about the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And to be more precise, the agreement has something like more than 1,300 pages. The agreement itself, it's around 60 to 70 pages that the annexes make the number of pages. So I have to confine, and I've chosen to talk about the fundamental freedoms. And if you have a look on the second slide, you will see that I restricted it to goods, services, and persons. So I'm not talking about payment and capitals. And what I want to do is, because the EU and Korea, there is already a framework, which is the WTO law. So what I want to do is the comparison, what is the WTO law, what has changed by introducing the free trade agreement, and then make a further comparison, what is still different between the EU and Korea compared to the situation between the EU member states. So I start with goods, and I start to explain the rules. Later we'll talk about the exceptions. And when it comes to rules, you can make a next distinction between tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, which means, do you restrict international trade by monetary, financial instruments, or do you restrict it by other means? And to help you follow, the Institute has uploaded on YouTube a PDF. And it's a table where you really have the comparison. And, you know, it's so much that it's different to put it on the slides. I don't know whether you can see it here. It looks like that. So I suggest that you download it and I hope it will help you follow what I explained to you. So I will start with the tariff barriers. And again, you can make a distinction whether the financial instruments are introduced at the moment when the good is crossing the border, or whether the financial instrument is imposed when the good is already within the country. I start with the instrument at the border, and we all know it. These are mainly customs duties. What we know from the WTO law is that, no, please, I will tell you if you switch to that. So yeah, you can, yes, thank you. Under the WTO law, customs duties are not abolished. The only thing what the WTO law, the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, says that there's a most favored nation treatment. So which means all members of the GATT shall be treated equally. No, I will tell you if you have to switch. Stay at page 2, please. So this means if one country lowers the customs duties for another country, they have to lower it to the same level for all the other WTO members. That's the situation under the GATT. And now the free trade agreement goes one step further. The first is EU and Korea shall not increase the customs duties. Under WTO law, that's possible. And second, EU and Korea shall eliminate all customs duties, not immediately, but there's a schedule. And now you know why there are these 1,300 pages, where you really have for every single good the rates and the time frame. And still, you have the provision on the most favored nation treatment. So if Korea is reducing the customs duties for the United States, they also have to reduce it for the European Union, even if under the schedule, they don't have to reduce them yet. Under the EU law, the situation is different. There's no schedule, and there are really all customs duties abolished. We have a general rule saying that customs duties are prohibited and also all charges having equivalent effect. And there's a second difference. Under the FTA, EU and Korea remain free to regulate their relations with third countries. Within the EU, there is no German customs tariff and no French and no Belgian one. The EU is a customs union, meaning there is a unilateral approach of the EU towards third countries. I go to the next part, financial means within the country. We have a provision in the GATT saying that imported goods shall receive the same treatment, the national treatment, the same as the domestic ones, when it comes to internal taxes and other internal charges. The FTA contains the same provision, and the EU law, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, contains the same provision. When it comes to non-tariff barriers, like quotas or licenses or import bans, we have a provision in the GATT saying that there shall be no such instruments. We have the same in the FTA, and we have the same in EU law. And perhaps now you think, but you know, there are some restrictions. How does it work? This is why I want to talk about the exceptions as well. We have a general exception under the GATT saying the states remain free to impose all necessary measures to protect life, health, environment, public morals, or national treasures. You see, in principle, there shall be no export bans and import bans, but if you want to protect national treasures, you can make export bans. If you want to protect the health against, what do you say, some food which is poisoned, then you can impose import bans. But these measures shall not concern disguised restrictions on international trade, so you shall not use them to overcome the obligations you have entered into. You have the same in the free trade agreement and the same in the EU law. Next exception, security exception, which means you can keep your state secrets, you can impose restrictions on weapons in war times and emergency times, and you can comply with your obligations under the UN Charter. So if there are import bans or export bans, you can comply with them. The FTA contains the same restriction. The EU also has such a restriction, but the restriction is more restricted because the member states have to ensure that the internal market is not affected by the measures, and they shall have consultations to ensure that the internal market can continue to work properly. Third exception, safeguard measures. The idea is if we reduce customs duties or abolish customs duties, perhaps then we couldn't foresee the development. So if there's such an increased importation that it causes serious injury to domestic producers, then the obligations can be suspended. We have this under the WTO law. We have the same under the free trade agreement, but in the EU it's different. Between the member states it's different. There is no safeguard clause anymore. So Germany can import as many cars to Italy as it wants, and as the Italian consumers want to buy, and Italy can export as many cars as they want to Germany. And if this means that perhaps Germany and Italy don't have car industry anymore, and because the market says that in one country there are the better conditions to produce cars, then the production will move to that country, and that is what is wanted. That is our idea of internal market. It's not 27 markets anymore. It's one common market. Fourth exception, anti-dumping duties. This is the idea that if one company reduces the price to a level which is lower than the costs they have, that's not a fair competition. And then the member state where the product is imported and causes problems to the domestic production can levy a duty to, which means you have the price and the duty is the price difference. So at the end, it's a fair price. The FTA contains the same possibility. But again, the EU does not have such anti-dumping laws anymore. What we have is competition law. So the way we deal with unfair competition is different. And now finally you can turn to the third slide. So for the conclusion, we have the main difference to WTO law, that when it comes to WTO law, there are still customs duties. For the FTA, no increase in customs duties anymore, and this schedule to eliminate all customs duties. And then you can turn to the fourth slide. This is the difference compared to EU law. Under the EU law, all customs duties are prohibited between the member states, and the EU, as I said, is a customs union, so they also have a common tariff vis-à-vis third countries. And there are less exceptions, so no safeguard clause, no anti-dumping clause. And if you have a look on the PDF, this is what is in bold. So the main differences are bold. I continue with the services. Again, this approach, first talking about the rules, second talking about the exceptions. When it comes to rules, you can distinguish between rules against discrimination and rules against restrictions. What we have under WTO law, this is a different treaty, not the GATT anymore, but the GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services. we again have the most favored nation treatment. So if you have an approach towards one country, you also have to offer the same conditions to all other members of the WTO. And now the FTO goes a little step further and says this is true even in case of economic integration agreements. Economic integrations agreements have a closer integration, so they can keep among themselves. And what now is the FTA says, if the EU or Korea have an economic integration agreement with a third country, they have to offer the same interesting conditions to either the EU to Korea or the Korea to the EU. When it comes to equal treatment with nationals, the situation is different. We remember when we talk about goods, it's national treatment. When it comes to services, it's not national treatment. It's only an equal treatment if the sector is in the schedule and there can be further conditions in the sector. So it's less liberalized than when it comes to goods. And the FTA still follows this approach. And you see again why we have this large number of pages in the schedules in the annexes. When it comes to restriction, it's the same approach. No general prohibition of restrictions as we had it for the goods, only following the annexes, only following if the sector is in the schedule. And still the FTA does not abolish all restrictions. Still, it depends on the annexes. So if we go to the fifth slide, we can have the conclusion. So services are less liberalized than goods. The FTA follows the approach of the GATS. So less liberalized than goods, no general approach, everything depends on the schedule. The only difference is that in case of an economic integration agreement, there is most favored nation treatment. When we go to the sixth slide, we can compare it to the EU law, and here really is a big difference. When we speak about EU law, we have a prohibition of discrimination, generally. No discrimination. It does not depend on the sector. It does not depend on the annex. It's all sectors, no further conditions. So if you have an architect, he can give his services in another EU member state under the same conditions as the domestic architects. And the EU also additionally has a prohibition of restrictions, also the general approach, not limited to sectors, no annex, not limited to further conditions. If I offer my services as a German in Austria, I can do it under the same conditions and without restrictions in Austria as well. When we talk about exceptions, there are exceptions for governmental authority, for public procurement. We have the general exception, we have the security exception, and we have further exceptions in the annex. As we said, it depends all on the conditions and restrictions in the schedules. This is different compared to the EU. There are no further annexes. What we have is the general exception and the security exception. So this was about, and I have to add something. The GATS knows the wording services. This includes both kinds of independent activity, the permanent one and the temporary one. The EU law has a different wording. We distinguish independent activity into permanent one, what we call establishment, and temporary one, which we call services. So services under EU law is less than services under WTO law. I use the WTO law. And the FTA now has the same wording as the EU law. So they also distinguish between establishment and services, but the provisions are equivalent. So the way they, both EU law and the FTA, they treat establishment and services is the same way, which mainly means prohibition of discrimination, prohibition of restriction, and less exceptions. Now I come to the last part, talking about persons, because you know, how do you offer your services? Normally by sending a natural person. Okay, there are some services which can cross the border itself, something like television, but mainly if we talk about architects or doctors or whatever, it's a natural person who offers the services or who permanently moves to the other country to offer the services there. So we need to talk about persons. Under the GATS, it's even more restricted than the goods and even more restricted than the services. We only have one annex saying that the states shall negotiate specific commitments. So everything depends on the commitments, and especially the GATS does not deal with employment, citizenship, and residence. So it's only the independent activity and depending on commitments. Is there any different when it comes to the free trade agreement? They reaffirm their commitments already entered into within the WTO frame. They establish a trade committee which can, inter alia, also negotiate some commitments. And the FTA contains some obligations itself, but they're limited to sectors and limited in time. So it's something like 90 days within 1 year or up to 3 years, something like that. If we have a look on the 7th slide, you have the comparison, what I said, less liberalized than goods, no general approach, less liberalized than services, even not in the schedule, but depending on negotiations. The difference when we compare the free trade agreement with WTO law, the free trade agreement contains some obligations itself, but, and I emphasize this, limited to certain sectors and in time. And I really emphasize this because, you know, if we turn to the 8th slide, if you compare it to WTO law, it's really different because the right to establishment and the free movement of services include the free movement of persons. So as an independent architect who wants to settle down in another EU member state, they can just rely on the right to establishment. They don't need further negotiations. They don't need any schedule. They are not limited in time. They are not limited to sectors. If I'm a German lawyer and I want to settle down in Austria and work as an independent lawyer in Austria, I rely on the right to establishment, no discrimination, no restriction, not limited to sectors, not limited in time. And for service, it's the same. If I'm a lawyer and just want to go to France to have one legal procedure before the European Court of Human Rights and then return back to Germany and keep my office in Germany, I can rely on the free movement of services. I don't need any further negotiations, no schedule, no nothing. I can just do it. And this is not even all. The EU law also deals with the free movement of workers. So what we had, services and establishments, are independent. The difference to workers is they are dependent. they have a boss who can tell them what to do and when to do. And you see, the EU has the free movement of workers, also not depending on sectors, not depending on further negotiation, not limited in time. So as a German, as an EU citizen, I can take every job in all the other 26 member states without restrictions, without discriminations. So no EU member state is allowed anymore to say, for this job, we only hire foreigners if we don't find any domestic national who wants to and who is capable to do the job. You can't give precedence to the domestic nationals anymore. And this is not all. It is even to the free movement of persons if we are not economically active. So at the moment, I'm a German citizen. I'm in Austria. I don't, my job is still at SNU, still in Korea. So in Austria, I'm not working as an independent and I don't have an employment. And still, as an EU citizen, I have the right to stay in Austria, not limited in time. For the persons who are not economically active, there are two further conditions which are not imposed on those who are economically active. I have to have financial means enough to cover my living. I can't have recourse to the social security system in Austria. So what I had to do was to show my salary specification to the Austrian authorities to prove that I don't need their social security. And I need a health insurance that even in case of illness, I don't need to ask the social security service in Austria to cover my costs. But in principle, what I can say about the EU is our idea is this idea of internal market, saying this is a free market for goods, for services, for persons, and for capitals. As a general rule, not depending on the negotiations, not depending on any schedule, not limited in time, not limited to sectors. There are, as we had for goods, we have also restrictions for establishment services, workers and non-workers. So if I commit a crime in Austria, and it's likely that I will continue to do it, then they have the right to send me back to Germany. But these are the conditions. So no one else. So this is what I wanted to show you, that the free trade agreement, there is a development compared to WTO law, which mainly concerns the goods, but the situation between EU and Korea is still different to the situation between the EU member states, and perhaps this can help you if you have followed the debate on Brexit. Perhaps this can help you to assess what Great Britain decided. That mainly they wanted to keep the situation when it comes to goods. They wanted to have a better situation than under the WTO law, without customs duties, so an agreement was needed, but they were reluctant to offer this mainly the free movement of persons. Thank you for your interest. I hope the PDF and the PPT have helped you to understand, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
네, 월지 다이버 교수님.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much for that presentation. you have talked to us about Korea, EU, FTA, and you have compared that to a WTO law as well as to the EU law. And you have talked to us about the comparisons in regards to goods, services, and persons. And you have sent us a PDF table. And it's a PDF you can download from the YouTube screen. So on the YouTube screen, there's a link. There's a WTO, FTA, TFEU table or PDF that you can download for your reference. And related to trade law, what you have talked to us for the past 30 minutes is something that can be taught over one semester. And Professor Oh is preparing for the discussion. And we are now going back to Mr. Kim Gamne, so that he's going to discuss Professor Pablo Sanz Bayon.
So let's invite Dr. Kim Gap-le of Korea Capital Market Institute. Please start your discussion.
And Professor Diver for your insightful presentation. And please allow me to speak Korean. 저는 먼저
First of all, I would like to make a discussion about Professor Bayon. The importance of strengthening the cooperation between Korea and EU. We need to once again enhance cooperation in the area of education, culture, social, and legal area. Which area is most important? Well, digital legislation and also soft power. And I truly agree with you. Especially you mentioned about BTS, and recently BTS has been maintaining the #1 position for more than 6 weeks. So upon listening to your comment, I could not agree more. Well, when we look at EU and Korea, especially the exchange of the legal system or legal development, which is led by the KLRI, I believe there are 3 reasons why we are focusing on. First of all, we all share the common law, both Korea and EU. Second reason is because EU is extremely important trade partner, and for EU, Korea is gaining its importance. And third, the most important reason, both EU and Korea, the most important point that we pursue is innovative growth. So the users and also the citizens need to be protected, which means that the government of Korea and also the government of the EU, both of us focus very much on the privacy protections, data protections, etc. In light of that, from the legal side, economic side, from legislative development side, once again, EU and Korea must once again enhance the exchanges in various fields. Now, how can we do that? How can we deploy exchanges? Well, I am very much focused on the virtual or cryptocurrency, including the Iridium or etc. We use different terminology like virtual asset, or we sometimes use different things. But according to the Korean law, we call this as a virtual asset. So please understand that I'll be using virtual asset, and I'll give a more specific example. Professor Pablo Bayon, you mentioned the case of the United States, and also you talk about the common law in the US. But while I do a lot of research in the virtual asset, I realized that, of course, Korea was very much influenced from the civil law, and everything is a top-down way. But we were heavily influenced by the United States. Why? Because if you look at the virtual asset as an example, in order to institutionalize virtual asset, we need to once again regard virtual asset as a secret token. And according to the Korean Security Act, if it falls under the category of the financial product, then it falls under different law. But if it's not a if it does not fall into the Security Act, then we need to come up with a new law. How can we define the Security Act? Here, we always follow the case of the United States. So anybody who are interested in virtual asset, you know that the international wire, when we do that, XRP is always used. There was a case of the XRP of the United States and also Coinbase, which was also the virtual asset exchange, and it was abolished. So among the digital asset, shall we fall under the Security Act or shall we fall under a different law? What kind of criteria shall we use? Here, we always comply with the United States law. Why? Because EU and Korea, we have the civil law system, but the biggest virtual asset or cryptocurrency market belongs to the United States. And Korea and EU, once again, they don't fall under the Security Act, but once again, without giving proper notice under the Security Act, under the strict supervisions by the fair competition law, the virtual assets are being traded. That is why we once again fall under the influence of the common law of the United States. So when we talk about strengthening the cooperation between Korea and EU, once again, we need to go hand in hand. The legal system and also the overhaul legislation. When we talk about enhancing the research and also cooperations between the Korea and EU, once again giving the example of the cryptocurrency or the virtual asset, we use the terminology of tokenization. What is it? Tokenization means real estate, or it could be the raw materials, or it could be financial products, whatever it is, we make it as a token. So tokenization means that within the blockchain network, we digitalize all of these assets. When we do that, there could be various benefits or advantages, like small and medium companies or venture companies, in order to attract investment by the venture capitalists. And in order for these small companies to grow within the blockchain network, they can enjoy tremendous benefits. They don't have to disclose their details, but they can use this distributed ledger, and also all the detail information can be exchanged and they can distribute it. And if they are allowed to do that, once again, there's a huge flexibility, as well as they can reduce the cost and also the distributions, because it is transacted within the network, can be further enhanced. Then why do we need international cooperation? As I mentioned before, EU also apply regulatory sandbox, and Korea also has a regulatory sandbox. And I will give example once again. There's a company called A. Let's hypothetically, there's A company, and this A company is a small and medium-sized company, but it has a tremendous potential IT technology, and they will distribute their list of shares. And first, the venture capitalist, VC, and angel investors will buy, and they will go eventually to the IPO. And when they do that, so they will digitalize all of their list of the shareholders. They can share the information within the digital network, and also everything will be done in the private equity way. So only the adequate investors can make an investment. And when we provide a legal service to these qualified investors, then we are providing the investor tools. And when it's distributed or when it's circulated, the private equity, the Security Act will not be applied, but rather within the digital network, everything will be automated. So smart contract, within the smart contract, the qualified, if you are not a qualified investors, then this will not be even transacted. So KYC or ALM, which means the Laundry Act, Provision Act, all of these regulation will not be applied because this is a blockchain network. So SMI can enjoy a tremendous benefit. Another biggest benefit is the qualified investors within the whitelist fall under the supervisions of the certain law. And EU and Korea, if we build the platform together, then investor base will be huge because of the network effect. That is why the EU market grew rapidly and their influence is tremendous. So going back to my main point is, in the future, EU and Korea needs to enhance its exchanges in legislative development here. Technology development and legal innovations must go hand in hand. And of course, Korea Legislation Research Institute has been doing this for the past 10 years and will soon enter into the 11th year. And we hope that we can have a more concrete support from both EU and Korea. And here comes my proposal. Korea provides regulatory sandbox, and EU also provides regulatory sandbox, and both sides revitalize the regulatory sandbox. And we, the Korea Legislation Research Institute, needs to take active part in, so that maybe we need to converge the regulatory sandbox and operate it together between the EU and Korea. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Dr. Kim, thank you very much for that discussion. You have, in a way, well summarized the presentation by Professor Bayon, and you have also talked to us about new technology based virtual security, virtual currency, as well as virtual assets. And you also mentioned that the EU and Korea need to cooperate further to ensure legal as well as technological revolution or innovation simultaneously. And at the same time, you said that both Korea and EU have a regulatory sandbox, and with the Korea Legislation Research Institute leading the effort, maybe the regulatory sandbox efforts can be made together by or jointly by Korea and EU. So, Professor Bayon, would you like to make any comment in regards to this discussion?
Yes, in my opinion, I want to say thank you for your comments, for your discussion comments. In my opinion, to introduce the point is that the prospect for the European and South Korea cooperation in the age of COVID and the US and China tension makes a very good externary for our cooperations. Besides the health emergency, a matter of growing concern for the European and South Korea is the socio-economic situation, which has been severely hit not only by the global pandemic-induced recession, but also by mounting tensions between the USA and China. So I think that European Union and the South Korea are going to keep the markets and the trading system very open. So there is a good chance to cooperate for the future, despite the tensions between China and the United States. I think that, and regarding the cryptocurrencies and tokens, I have to say that we are going to regulate the cryptocurrencies very soon in Europe. The future European regulation for a crypto assets market called MiCA will be especially important for the two interconnected fintech fields within the crypto industry that have dominated the fintech narrative in the last year. Above all, I will mention stable coins, not decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. I mean stable coins. The cryptocurrencies which have a stability system by algorithmic or some other assets back. So the draft of MiCA now regulation is currently in the proposal phase presented by the European Commission. It has to go through a long legislative process before it becomes regulation. I calculate that we will have this regulation for crypto assets probably next year, in the spring next year, or in summer next year, probably. It has a long legislative process, European regulation with general scope and direct effectiveness for 27 member states. So I recommend you, if you are interested in this topic, I can provide you more information about this proposal about the European regulation for a crypto assets market. Thank you so much for your comments.
감사합니다. 배영 교수.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayon. I once again realized that we need to collaborate. Maybe we need one more session and then we can discuss about how both sides can collaborate in terms of the cryptocurrency or virtual asset.
으로 기다리고
Professor O, would you like to discuss Professor Daiber's presentation? Good afternoon. My name is Oh Sun-young from Sungsil University. Professor Daiber has talked about freedom in trade. You talked about that. You looked at the WTO law as well as Korean EU FTA, and you also talked about the EU law, and you compared them. And I was able to acquire a lot of things, and it was an excellent opportunity for me to hear about the EU law, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss. But there was this question. WTO, Korea EU FTA, and EU law. When you do the comparisons, should you be comparing these three? Because WTO has about 170 different countries. As Professor Daiber has mentioned, each nation has trade-related guidelines under WTO. And each nation have trade laws, and those laws should not go against the rules of WTO. And then other member countries can file a lawsuit or can lodge a complaint. But the WTO has many member countries when it comes to tariff, services, and intellectual property. But there are limitations. So in order to overcome those limitations, FTAs have become popular. And so these FTAs that are concluded by the WTO member countries need to be in compliance with the WTO laws. And so FTA, in order to be exception to MFN, there are, for instance, when WTO, you are able to impose duties. And those duties are legal, means to protect, a country's industry. But among the FTA countries, they are eliminating the duties or tariff to liberalize trade. And so the duty talked about by WTO and the duties mentioned by the FTAs, well, they are not exactly the same. It would be difficult to compare the two, directly. And EU law, as Professor Daiber mentioned in her presentation, in EU there are many countries, and you also have a customs union. And I think EU is an economic integrated entity that goes further than customs union. There will be no tariff barriers among the EU member countries. There are not many limitations in terms of services, and the people can move also quite freely among EU member countries. So from our point of view, EU is a single country, a single market. And so within EU, the tariffs or non-tariffs or the goods and services, well, I think there will be no restrictions. But EU's trade laws and the Korean law, Korean, that is trade law. So if you compare these two trade law, I mean, it would have been really nice, if you could have been, we could have compared these differences or the similarities between the EU's trade laws and Korea's trade laws, because we do not really understand EU's trade laws. And so maybe the institute could provide, English version of the Korean trade laws, so that foreign scholars can do the comparison. And so I think EU is more than custom union. I mean, so EU is a single market. And about the services, I was able to learn so much. This was an excellent opportunity for me to learn. Of course, service would be different from goods. And each nation, when concluding, FTAs, when Korea has an FTA with EU, well, the markets are liberalized market, and so the service market would have been opened in a negative way. So I have not read all the service chapters within the Korea EU FTA agreement, so I do not know the details. But what I want to say is this: when it comes to services, things will be different among countries, because you could follow a positive method or the negative method in opening the service markets. So this will be quite different from the goods market. And related to persons, I was curious. Maybe I misunderstood. According to WTO law, you said the people's movement could be up to negotiation. So the WTO deals with intellectual properties and goods and services. So related to people within WTO law, where is it covered? And Korea EU FTA, I also have a question related to this. I think you mentioned, about the certificate or license. So a Korean doctor, if he wants to start his practice in Europe, his license, are there limitations? Is he allowed to open his medical practice in Europe? So if you could explain this, it would be quite nice. And Professor Diver, this was an excellent opportunity to learn. Thank you. Professor Oh, thank you very much. WTO laws, the EU laws, and the Korea EU FTAs, you said that it would not be quite best to directly compare the three. And I think you had some questions. You had some questions related to people. How the people movement, how is it dealt with within FTA or WTO? We know that it's up to negotiation. If you could explain more. And in Korea, EU FTA about, professionals with the licenses. Could they, start their practice in each other's country? Are there laws governing this or regulations governing this? So if you could explain more. Professor Diver, would you like to answer?
You said so much, so I hope I can answer to all. The first point, you made this distinction between WTO law and the FTA, and that the FTA, when it comes to goods and abolishing of customs duties, of course, they have to be in line with the WTO law for WTO member states. And you're right, there is a problem. Because, if you conclude a free trade agreement and you abolish the customs duties, in principle, you have to apply the most favored nation treatment, and they have to give the same favorable conditions to all other WTO member states, even for the countries who are not included in the FTA. So in principle, this didn't work. And the solution is Article 24 of the GATT, saying that if a state concludes a free trade agreement, this is possible because WTO wants to liberalize the market, so they want to foster it, or at least not hinder it, which means in that case, the most favored nation treatment doesn't apply. So third countries cannot rely on a free trade agreement to say we want to have the same conditions. But there is one condition. You know, if you abolish customs duties, as a state, you have less income, which means the state must not raise their customs duties towards third countries to compensate, because then it's not a liberalization for everybody, then it will be harmful to the third countries. So if the EU abolishes all the customs duties between the EU member states, they cannot raise the customs duties for Korea or for the United States. And then you made this important point about the wording. Free trade area means no customs duties between the states included in the free trade area. Customs union is a free trade area plus a common customs tariff towards third countries. And as you said, single market is even more, not compared to goods, but if we have a look at the EU, it means free movement not only of goods, but also of services and persons and capital. And then you said, you're right, we could have compared to Korean trade law, which I don't know, because in Korea I teach EU law, not Korean law. And I don't know whether there already is a translation. So my suggestion would be, if we really want to do the comparison, I would need a Korean colleague specialized in Korean trade law, because you know much more about Korean trade law than I will ever know. So I think if we want to do the comparison, we need a cooperation. And then, in the discussion, we would find the differences and similarities. I have done this with one Korean colleague when we talked, a different topic. It was about banning of political parties. But I think this really makes sense because, I have the German background. I know the German judgment, and he knows the Korean background and the Korean judgment. And then when discussing, then we really find out more together than everybody of us could have done individually. So when we, your next point was this distinguishment between goods, where we have a developed liberalization, services, less liberalization, and persons, even less liberalization. And we, as you said, under the WTO law, we have one treaty for the goods, the GATT. We have another treaty for the services, the GATS. We have a third treaty for the trade-related intellectual property, TRIPS. But we have no treaty on persons. We only have this annex to the GATS saying that the right of persons to cross the border to offer their services depends on negotiations. For the FTA, there are some obligations in the FTA itself. And for the EU, we have free movement of persons. That's the difference. So you're right, I explained what I can do as a lawyer with a German exam in France, Belgium, Austria, and the other EU member states. When it comes to Koreans, they are not covered by EU law. So you, with a Korean legal exam, you cannot rely on the provisions of the EU treaties to say, I offer my law firm in Germany, Sweden, Poland, wherever. So it depends on the domestic law, and I think for the lawyers, they are under German law. I'm not the most specialist, but some years ago, I looked it up, and I think there are two opportunities. Either you say, I'm only dealing with Korean law in Germany, because it could be interesting to those in Germany who want to have connections with Korea, so they need the legal advice on Korean law. Or it could be interesting for Koreans living in Germany. I think this is possible because then you have the exam. Or the other way is if you want to deal with German law, you need to show that you have the knowledge on German law. And the third point is what are the rules on really third country nationals coming to Europe? They are different. And you can see it when it comes to, especially now in the Corona crisis and all the travel restrictions. So for every country allows its own citizens to come back. And I know it for Germany and for Austria, they also allow the EU citizens to come into the country. They don't make a distinction between the domestic nationals and all other EU nationals. They make a distinction for third country nationals. But you know, for me, as a German living in Austria, even under the EU pandemic, I could return to Austria, where I now have my apartment under the same conditions as Austrian current.
네, 감사합니다.
Professor Diver, thank you very much. And I think you've answered all the questions posed by Professor Oh. And we are streaming live on YouTube. And so many people have joined us. And I have asked them to leave questions if they have any. And because Professor Oh and Dr. Kim have asked a wide range of important questions, I think we are not receiving any further questions.
Before we wrap up, I would like to make one or two comments on behalf of all the participants. It's not a question, but rather it's a comment. First, Professor Sans Bayon, during your presentation, you mentioned about World Bank Doing Business Index. And in case of Doing Business Index, among these startups in Korea or opening their own business, how do they perceive Korea's business environment? Is it easy to do the business or not? And within the World Bank, as a subset survey, I have had a chance to see the index. And as Professor Sans Bayon mentioned, Korea overall Doing Business Index is doing fairly well. The score is really high, and especially among the subset score, startup index is really high. However, within the subset, some we are like number one, but in terms of the startup, we are not number one. And we try to analyze the reason. And we had a couple of meetings together with the government officials to understand the reason why Korea's Doing Business category within that, why startup index is not so high. And what World Bank evaluate is it easy to start the business or not? And there are a couple of steps. How many steps do the entrepreneurs or the business owner needs to undergo? In case of Korea, we have reduced the steps that startup company need to undergo, and we provide one-stop service. Despite these efforts, we still have 1 day to complete all of this process. So in order to open their own business or in order to start up the business, it requires at least 1 day. The reason is because they have to come up with the company seal and they have to register their company seal. And the shortest time could be shortened by half a day, but still, because of these requirements of having the company seal, you cannot register your own company. So this is the biggest hurdle in Korea. And when we compare Korea's situations with the other countries, what's their startup index? And we found out that most of the countries that are above Korea, well, they don't require any company seal. All of them are Western countries. Everything can be done by signature of the startup owner. In case of Asian countries, Singaporean startup companies, they can use the signature instead of company seal. So I was able to see that case. And when we had a meeting with the government officials, we exchanged the views that we need to reduce this company seal requirement or get rid of that and then replace it with the signatures, and then we can definitely become number one. And we live in the era of digitalization, and definitely Korea is enjoying the number one IT infrastructure, and we are definitely IT superpower. But still, because of this social or customary practice, we cannot change the people's awareness overnight, and that is why still company seal is required. And that's why in order to start up the company, it requires at least 1 day. And Professor Sansbeyo, you talk about the soft power, and I believe that we need to understand the culture of a certain country, and by doing that, definitely we can get rid of all the hurdles. Since you mentioned of the doing business index, I just made one comment, and let me make a second comment. Professor Daiba.
또 이제
About trade, global trade, and you talked about tariff, and you also talked about the most favored nation and treatment. The latest trend, and as you know, and this is discussed at G7 meeting as well as the OECD meeting, is to impose global corporate tax. So a company doing business in no matter where that company does business, for that company not to try to evade taxes and to be fairly taxed. So there was discussion to make a base to impose taxes fairly, and I think this is related to a digital business. I understand that in EU there was a talk about digital service tax. So there was a lot of discussion about the digital service tax. I think that started in France last year. I understand that Canada is going to begin this year. And digital business, I think, is influencing all areas of our lives. So it was so much. I found all the presentations and discussions so interesting. And the comments that I see on YouTube are very good. They are very much impressed with the presentations and discussions. And so, and I think you kept giving us homework. That is the assignment, about, doing the translation, about doing the publication, and about in-depth study of the crypto assets, and about comparing the different trade laws of different countries. So you have given us a lot of ideas for future projects. So thank you so much for those ideas. Any ideas or comments before we wrap up? If not, with this, we would like to conclude session 1 of KLRI Forum 2021. Session 2 and 3 will begin at Korea time, 8 o'clock. We will be talking to Korean law scholars from the East Coast, West Coast, as well as the Pacific, west and East Coast of the U.S. and the Pacific regions. So this concludes the first session, and our YouTube streaming will be stopped now. And with the presenters and the discussant, we would like to take a commemorative picture. So if you could stay, we'll take a picture together. So this concludes the first session.
Okay, then. So let's commemorate the first session of KLRI Forum. Let's have a group photo online. So everybody just stare at your camera on your laptop. And then we're going to go in my counting 3. 1, 2,